is Amber, and I'm giving a presentation, kind of just the basics on leftist unity and some topics I wanted to highlight, and some terminology that gets thrown around a lot in leftist circles, but a lot of the times the terminology is being used incorrectly, or those on the receiving end don't really know like what they're being called. They just hear the term, and because the term to them means something else, they kind of like misinterpret it, and they're like, yeah, I'm a liberal, what about it? You know? So that's kind of the first part, and then the second half of my presentation, I wanted to be more on the organizational end, more so on like inter-organizational team building, what that looks like, and how it should be weathered, because obviously there are stages when you're working with other organizations and you don't necessarily agree with all their politics, but you're working on them for a particular policy or subject. So how do you manage that? How do you kind of weather the storm? And more so what you guys in the audience would do in some scenarios that I wanted to lay out. So yeah, let's get to it. Leftist unity, a pipe dream. So these are the terms that I'm going to be defining this evening: revisionism, reformism, liberalism, and reactionary. Who they are, what they stand for, what exactly those terms mean more in a Marxist context than would be typical to hear kind of on the screen. So what is a reactionary, truly, right? I feel as though probably everyone in the room at one point or another has been called a reactionary on the internet, when in reality it's more appropriately used in regards to paleo-conservatism or groups like UKIP, the American Tea Party, kind of like those who would follow Reaganomics would be a really good example of that. So the more conservative movements in the already conservative circuit in the US would fall into this category. I personally would consider them to be a pretty substantial threat, just because their organizational strengths come through unity and kind of like blindly following a policy that doesn't really have any core beliefs, but can draw from an individual's personal experience to the extent that they feel comfortable in these authoritarian circles or organizations. So what do you do when you come across a reactionary? Me personally, particularly on the internet, you should probably just ignore it. However, if you're in reality, it's probably a better idea to actually engage the person on an individual level, unless they're just spewing like nonsense, like statistics from Nazi era policies, I guess. So that would be the primary course of action. Let me go to my notes. Yeah, so to be clear, this presentation overall is focused on leftist unity, right? I'm not really trying to bring in particularly liberal, a term that we'll be defining later, organizations into spaces where it's fairly obvious they will not be able to operate because existentially have different goals. However, particularly on the anti-authoritarian left, there is a lot of room, not necessarily for compromise, but for cooperation on particular subjects, even if not on others, as the overall goal is still the same, to destroy the state, right? So another feature of the reactionary is sort of the unbiased bias, where they will try and present themselves as something other than the agenda that they are actually trying to present to you. So a really good example of that would be, let's see. Man, these are really tiny. So you're in a conversation with someone and they bring in a statistic from 1939 that has been disproven 15 times over. How do you actively engage with the person beyond that, right? On the internet, you should probably just block the person, but if you're in an actual social setting, I would suggest personally literally pulling out your phone and showcasing counterpoints, like hard proof for the unbiased bias. That term isn't necessarily the most fun to say, but it is the most accurate, I would consider, in this setting. I think it's really important to remember that the reactionary is extremely harmful and actually antithetical to significant social progress, particularly if you are intimately involved in a leftist organization. So I actually have some questions on the board if anyone would like to interact on that.
Sure.
I see a lot of nodding.
Yeah,
okay. I see someone in the audience.
Okay.
Hand on chin.
So I was thinking particularly of the last question, because that is, I mean, I think nowadays it's more of a common situation for most of us.
Mm-hmm.
Number 3 is also very common, like being someone's reactionary reality, but honestly, what you said is very good piece of advice, which is that if it's someone who's just sharing these memes of like, oh, communism killed 100 million people or whatever, and they're not really, there's no substance, then a block is probably the best use of your time. I've also had a lot of situations where, I did sort of argue with that person or debate to a standstill because they seem to be coming with some, if not from a reasonable position, then at least they were kind of responding to the points I was making. So essentially it's just kind of like following the thread until.
Yeah, so actually those with unbiased biases actually tend to be more emotionally based in their arguments than you might find otherwise, because they're likely drawn from a position of pain, or they're perceiving something to be not as it actually is in reality. So in cases where you can see what argument the person is trying to make, but they just literally have the wrong facts, then that would be where you engage with the individual. However, otherwise, this actually happened to me a couple of weeks ago, if you're in an Uber or a Lyft, and your Uber driver just starts spewing nonsense, just don't engage them. Because A, they're driving the car, but also B, I feel as though in some settings, it's fairly obvious when you're not going to change the person's mind. So, I guess social tact would be the phrase.
But I mean, for example, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was in an Uber, and the guy was Pakistani, and he was like pretty cool, and we had like a really good conversation, and then we started talking about like affordable housing in D.C., and just like how bad it is for working class people to live there, and how like they're being pushed out, and then he like just threw like something out of left field, and he was just like, yeah, and like the thing is that like, if you want to get an affordable apartment in Washington D.C., like you got to move to the black neighborhood, and we all know that you don't want to live among those people. And I was just like, to me it was like record scratch. Like I was just like, oh, like no, we got to talk about this. And like I just kind of like talked about it with him. We got into a conversation about like racial dynamics in like the United States, and, like racism, and like I feel like it was like a pretty productive conversation actually, and he like kind of like backtracked as to like what he was saying. I mean, I don't know if I like changed his like mind in this like 30-minute conversation, but I feel like he was probably like a little embarrassed by what he said, and he was just like, oh, okay, yeah. That was probably like a bad thing that I said.
Hasn't been my experience. Sorry, go ahead.
I think that there's like you're kind of talking about two different things, and I think that's something that's hard to distinguish between is like determining who actually is there to kind of troll you and who's actually willing to like hear you out. And I think that like people that are on the internet comment on every post you make and are kind of have their own like ideology, which in that moment seems to just be obnoxiously trying to argue against everything you're posting. Like I feel like that's an example of someone who's not willing to engage you. But that example is someone who maybe can be shifted in their perspective or their ideology and isn't necessarily someone who like we might term reactionary. And so I think that like the hard part is distinguishing who's a troll and who like maybe has is not like fully evolved in their politics or in their own beliefs.
Yeah, so I think I maybe muddled the waters a bit with my Uber driver scenario as I didn't really flesh it out into detail. It wasn't a generalization about Uber drivers, it was just that this one particular experience was bad. Like he was ranting at me in my own neighborhood talking about how like me being stopped by police every 10 minutes in Miami is actually a good thing and I should reconsider my outlook. Like that's not something I'm going to engage in if I'm trying to get to a place that I need to be, particularly if it's something important to me. And honestly, it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of input for what I know will be a very small output in a situation where I feel as though it's not necessary and it won't affect any change. So I feel as though UKIP, persons who prescribe to Reaganomics, that brand of person is not at all the same as the brand of person that you were talking about. And it requires tact when you're in these situations to read the conversation and what they're actually trying to say, their subtext, and make that determination one-on-one if it's in reality. But if someone is trolling you on the internet, like, just block them.
The internet has like a way of bringing the worst out of people.
Yeah, myself included, honestly. Oh, I don't know, I've become meaner since like Trump got elected. Like I look at my posts and I was like, damn, I used to be so nice.
Yeah.
But like to your point, I do think it, like you have to like judge the situation in the moment. Like there are like if someone's saying something like stupid, like you were saying like the taxi driver, but I think it's just like off the cuff and like obviously it's just like blowing it out of his like ass or whatever, like then you can like step in and like try to reorient and be like, actually I don't think that was such a good thought, like here's why. Like you can tell like from the ranting that you're saying like the person is just obviously just trying to like berate you into agreeing with him or whatever. Then obviously it's just like you're a waste of my time. Yeah. This is like you're like oh I'm gonna make this person mad. Like then it's like well you're not gonna get what you want from me. I'm not gonna get mad. Online, like if I know the person, I usually just keep scrolling. If it's a stranger or someone in a group that I'm in that I don't know, I usually have to sound off in some way. There's some stuff where I'm just like someone has to say something. Like, yeah. But like and to your point with UKIP, like yeah, like a Pakistani driver might say something like bad and reactionary just off the cuff, but you don't accidentally join UKIP. Like you thought about it if you're in those spaces.
You don't accidentally become an editor for the National Review.
Yeah, that's something you planned for.
Yeah. So just to circle back a bit, because I think where the misinterpretation came in was in my definition of a reactionary. I'm not trying to broaden that to anyone except those who've expressed like detailed interest in a particular ideology that is antithetical to positive change. Period. So that would be just a paleo-conservative or any of the organizations or newspapers that we've been talking about in this conversation.
Like someone who's anti-modernity, basically, right?
Yeah. So who exactly are liberals and why does my uncle keep right? I feel as though the misinterpretation comes in because the way that most Marxists use the term, it is mostly to describe like everyone from George H.W. Bush to Hillary Clinton to Barack Obama to a Reagan. So it's a broader term, particularly for the American political system, as they all tend to operate within these measures that prohibit actual leftist organizations from really coming into the fray. So you'll have a Democratic Party and a Republican Party, but ideologically speaking, they'll have a lot of the same neoconservative views. So when you are operating in a social setting, right, and maybe you're drunk at a bar and you call some guy liberal and they're like, damn, that's right. Maybe it's worth explaining to them, kind of broadening your perspective, because I've had a lot of personal experiences where the definition of liberalism will actually like come into question and people will have heated debates just because they're not really using the term in the same context and therefore are misinterpreting one another. So it's really worth noting that liberalism in Marxist circles means something completely different and is derived from a completely different history than it is in kind of like American circles. And it is very much specific to the US. I wouldn't broaden that to the greater Western world. Yeah, so I had a really bad joke that I found on the internet. What do George Bush, Ron Paul, and Hillary Clinton all have in common? They're all liberals. It's not really a joke, but I feel as though it encapsulates the term fairly well for those who may not know it. And although there may be different approaches to capitalism, so more like a state interventionist capitalism versus like a laissez-faire sort of capitalism, although there are those distinctions within it, they are still under the same branch overall of liberalism. And I feel as though it can be even further be defined by an antipathy for the far left. For example, if you were to bring up anything remotely Marxist or maybe some anarchist undertones into your liberal work circle, it probably wouldn't go over well. Like it would be received poorly to the extent that it would just be shut down immediately. They would just say, this does not work, period. What are you talking about, period? I feel as though if there is an openness in a person to such ideologies, then just kind of labeling them and framing it as like a weird half slur is a bit counterproductive when you're trying to. Go ahead.
Like, so what, like, if we're just like describing a liberal as and
Yeah.
like ranging from like Dave Rubin pedants to like rainbow capitalists of like the Wynwood variety. Like, how do you see our engagement like with liberals being different than our engagement with reactionaries in a manner that would be productive for a leftist?
Okay.
David,
So-
have you ever heard him say he's a classical liberal? Yeah. It's funny. Yeah. It's the same thing today though.
Yeah, I mean, there is like political liberalism and economic liberalism.
Right, so
And like in left circles, it's like we're really debating more about a liberal political style. We might agree that like the liberal economic vision is not something we want, but it's more of a political side.
yeah, so I was going to go a little further and kind of define like the three tenets that, in my opinion, would really define liberalism. So for me, it would be a kind of like free market capitalist mindset, kind of like a state and representative democracy as their like overall preferred form of government, and a focus on the individual instead of like class struggles. So they would, instead of viewing racism as like an overarching structure, they would view it as like a personal issue. No, like this individual is racist. So in terms of interacting with them, I feel as though it's likely, actually no, from experience, it's a lot easier to get through to someone who is liberal versus someone who is reactionary, particularly because a lot of the times liberals are misinformed, but in a different way, that they view kind of like leftist or Marxist managerial styles or economic models as completely inefficient. So if you were to do away with that fallacy in particular, a lot of other liberal arguments kind of domino after that, because they're all based around free market capitalist ideals being the only form of government economic model that would work. So that would be how I would approach them. Interacting with them also on social issues would probably be a good way in, as they tend to be less radical than reactionaries concerning that, as reactionaries tend to be more on the, particularly in the US, ultra conservative and also particularly Christian. So a liberal is less likely to hold those beliefs as strongly and to such toxic degrees. So at least like your garden variety Wynwood guy. But there are degrees to liberalism, there are sects to it, as there are different schools of thought within liberalism. So it would make sense to approach them in different ways. Go ahead.
So I had a friend who like was very hardcore into liberalism and like slash like I guess like libertarianism a little bit, and she's like probably farther left than I am now. And one of the things that did it for her, she said, was I used to say, oh, I'm a fiscal conservative but a social liberal, and it wasn't until someone pointed out how fiscal conservatism leads to social illiberalism that I had to drop the fiscal conservatism altogether.
Yeah. So pointing out flaws in their economic model tends to just be the primary route. So which elements of liberalism would you all audience consider to be the most problematic? As I'm curious.
Like the pro-capitalist part, like I think capitalism can be
Right, but I mean like particular policies and
Oh, I see.
Imperialism.
I think those are good answers, but I think it's just like the failure or refusal to see like the inherent contradictions within like capitalist society. It's like particularly exacerbated in like America. Because I'll give an example. I don't want to take up too much time, but on NPR I was like listening today about like a bunch of liberals calling in and freaking out about Trump appeasement to North Korea, and they were saying like, oh, it's hypocritical because when Obama met Raúl Castro in Cuba, all these conservatives freaked out, and now they're like praising North Korea.
Right.
And that's a great point actually, but I wanted to just call in and be like, no, it's hypocritical. It's the fact that we American bombers like literally said there's nothing left to bomb in North Korea during the Korean War. We like carpet bombed like Cambodia, Laos. We dropped atomic bombs. We're putting children on cages right now in America. Like our CIA director ran a freaking torture site in Thailand, and she just got confirmed. Like we are guilty of like the same fucking human rights abuses, if not more, in North Korea across the world. And like liberals just like consistently turn a blind eye to all this bullshit. So it's just like shocking to me.
So do you think they're consciously turning a blind eye to it, or do you think they're somehow justifying it within their ideology, or they're being fed a news source that is telling them that these things are actually good, like they're listening to a particular spin? What about it do you think?
I think that the sort of humanitarian interventionism is sort of the status quo of like the corporate media, and it's like the only time that Trump is good. Oftentimes is when he's being like when he's intervening militarily in other countries. It seems like that's the most unifying thing.
So presidential.
Yeah. So I would say that it's that's kind of the ideological status quo in the United States. So it's I would argue that it's not really people's like fault for supporting humanitarian intervention and imperialism, because that's what they're fed.
Yeah, I agree. Reforms versus reformism on the daily. So this is particularly relevant to leftist organizations, as I know particularly DSA and other similar organizations are often labeled as reformist as opposed to organizations who impose reforms. So I'm curious, as there are a lot of DSA members in the audience, how you would define reformism in relation to the activities conducted within DSA, or if you would just consider yourself an organization who does reforms. Because there are a lot of you guys.
Well, so excuse me. So I think there's some people in like DSA and people who write for Jacobin or whatever, who use the phrase like non-reformist reforms, which I think and as in like that's like that, those are like the kinds of reforms to support are reforms that are reformist. And I think there's like sort of better wording that we can use there, like transformative reforms or emancipatory reforms. But I think like reformism comes out of the liberal idea that
electoral politics within the state.
Yeah, so it comes so reformism is like a great example of it would be that Fukuyama essay, The End of History, where he says all that's left is little tinkering here and there, but the basic model is we've got it figured out. We know what the basic model is. We've got it. Now it's just a matter of tinkering with it and calibrating it just so. So that's to me that's like the essence of reformism. But a reform doesn't have to be reformist. A reform can be transformative. So that you can pass laws like within like the bourgeois state that get you a lot closer to a society that has, true equality and liberation. And I think that's sort of the difference, I guess, is the way I would define it.
You would define what DSA does more on the
When it's doing what it should do, I mean,
Well, I mean,
yeah,
the
yeah,
local.
what I would define is like what I would like DSA to be is like an organization that uses, both that pursues both legislative and non-legislative avenues toward a liberated society.
Any other comments? I saw some face touching, head scratching. So if anyone has comments, please feel free. These questions are actually just things people have asked me or I've heard, or it's kind of like FAQ type questions concerning the topic.
No, I was just thinking about Amendment 4 and like the work that like Miami DSA has been doing for that, right? And raising awareness about it and making sure people know what it is and getting people to vote for it, right? Like as a socialist and as a member of DSA, I believe in like abolishing the prison system and abolishing like all police. But like while we have an amendment that's going to be like up for vote, that I'm willing to take some concessions to do like some of the legislative and like electoral work. So like, I guess like, and it's funny that this is the next section because I was thinking before this, like liberals were like, they want to reform as I want to like rebuild the whole state.
Yeah.
But I think it's a lot of it is like, the other thing I think about liberals is like, oh, but I'm still willing to work within this framework. So like the concessions that I make as like, I'm a member of like a political group, I guess, and it happens to be, DSA, is that when there are like progressive measures, I'll like fight for them, even though they're not going as far as like I would like as a member of this group or as like, speaking for myself. So.
Okay, very interesting. I think if there's a combination of working within and outside the system, then an organization shouldn't necessarily be labeled as reformist as of yet. However, if they are operating exclusively within those systems, within the state, then that is where you can run into issues if they're not trying to do anything kind of extrajudicially. So as a local, I would rate Miami DSA pretty well, as there is a good mix of both. However, as a national organization, there are definitely a lot of critiques to DSA concerning reformism that I think are extremely valid.
So there's a tension at the national level, especially in some of the larger, if we're talking about DSA exclusively, it's not DSA only by any means, it's like a bunch of sectors on the left, but there's sort of this inherent tension about reformism where, let's say you get people elected who are kind of friendlier to socialism. Historically, what it tends to mean is that if you have people like folks on the ground that are trying to push further and it can somehow like jeopardize or put, institutional reform in peril, what you have is like that group of politicians kind of trying to put the brakes on the more radical side of it. Right now in the United States, that's mostly like a theoretical possibility because, there's some people that are like affiliated with DSA who got elected or who won primaries, but it hasn't developed yet. But I'm starting to, there's certain intellectuals who are affiliated with like social democracy or the left who are kind of like, they want the more radical elements of the left. They call them like wreckers and stuff like that. They kind of want them to like cool their heels and kind of let the reform process play out for a certain indefinite amount of time. So like that's something I have my eye on. It's a possible problem here, where like the reform process just kind of takes on, kind of becomes this like its own thing and sort of drowns like the other, like the pushing past it part that like he was talking about.
Yeah, so once you start focusing exclusively on those reforms within the system and you ignore other aspects of social work or interacting with other leftist groups that are actually doing more revolutionary things, then that's where you would be considered reformist. So I agree with that.
Can I ask something?
Go ahead.
I just moved to Miami last week. I'm from New York. The DSA in New York looks very. I mean, they're very different. There's a much wider spectrum of leftist organizing that I know of. Like, are there groups that are doing more leftist revolutionary organizing in Miami? Because my very brief exposure to Miami politics is that like there's less space for that, and so that opens the space for the Miami DSA to kind of fill a wider role or play a larger role.
There are other organizations, I just don't think you'll match them in terms of consistent activity, particularly in Miami. But after the lecture, I don't want to be like name dropping organizations like Miami. I'm not going to do that. But definitely, yeah, I'd love to talk to you. Originally, when I was developing this presentation, I wanted to give a historical context to every term I was defining.
So you're about low battery.
Yeah, I can't.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry.
But I decided not to at the last minute after seeing Jonathan's presentation, as I thought something more interactive would probably be more interesting. But I wanted to kind of keep the slide in, as it does relate to what we were just talking about in terms of an organization slipping away from reforms and more into reformism, particularly in her case. And I highlighted two pieces that she has written, Reform or Revolution and The Mass Break. The Mass Break was actually written alongside someone else. And I'm sorry about the low battery. I don't know what to tell you. Sorry, you had your hand up?
Probably.
Oh, yes.
I used to work for SEIU and like Lenin is right. Like the second quote. So it's like, oh yeah.
It's context.
Just like believed that the labor aristocracy was a result of the ruling class buying out a group of workers and labor officials from the super province of imperialism. It's true.
I completely agree with that.
And then like also that union leaders tended towards bureaucratism or evaluation of the organization. And I'm not saying that like labor unions are bad. It's obviously like
Yeah.
they're good overall. And like SAU and other people do like great work, but like it's just like a tendency of like stagnation and like just like becoming reformist.
Or hierarchies being formed in settings where they aren't necessarily necessary and can end up being counterproductive. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I mean, that doesn't happen in a vacuum though. It happens because there's like an emphasis on working within the system. That's why like unions go the bureaucratic route, because there's like widespread faith in like representative democracy to do its thing, and you know, people push for that. Like in the case of like what you have here in the slide, the SPD, they claim to be socialists, and yet they push a strategy that basically turned the unions into like a bureaucratic partner, while you know, they say, oh, well, we have to do it kind of gradually. And that's really, to me, what created this phenomenon. It didn't happen like, it happened in this wider, you know, political and economic context, basically. So, yeah, like that idea of like integration and kind of like co-opting these rank and file kind of groups.
So, I'm going to stay on this slide for the picture.
Thank you. My hands really shaky.
Revisionist, the Maoist version of being called a liberal. I have been called revisionist a lot. I feel as though, in part, it has been a rite of passage. But let me see through my notes very quickly. Unfortunately, I could not print any of this. So, okay, I guess I don't have my notes on this one. So basically, when someone's calling you a revisionist, they're basically saying that you strayed away from class struggle or kind of like the basic Marxist economic model of doing away with the state at the end of the day completely. I also had a historical context for this because at the end of the day, even the Maoists ended up being called themselves revisionist after 1978. So I love this one. Not a whole lot to say other than I do not think modernizing a doctrine automatically equates to revisionism. However, if what you mean by modernizing means erasure, then that's obviously not what we're here for. Secondly, how does the issue of revisionism affect how leftist organizations view structural change? So I found personally with Maoist organizations, they'll want to function entirely outside of the state, just kind of do it all one way. And unfortunately, I don't agree with that. I don't think that it would be particularly useful in the case of the US, especially in 2018. You have something to say? No, I thought you were halfway in here. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, I haven't had an itch.
Particularly in the context of activism, local sort of recruitment, when you kind of canvass or you show your zines at a particular event. Someone may literally just come up to you and call you revisionist. Particularly if they're a hardliner or if they're on the list of organizations that would deem themselves to be anti-revisionist, which is a real thing.
Not to do horseshoe theory, but like it always struck me like the people who like lay down the revisionism charge, like are just doing like an end of history, but of their point in history, like Maoism was the last word in any attempt to like I don't know. It always struck me as like this is the final say, basically. It's almost suspicious though.
Yeah, basically this is where we are. We have to stay here forever.
Right.
And I do think when applied correctly, you could argue that when an action is labeled as revisionist, they're trying to get you to not make a lot of the same mistakes as the Cultural Revolution, but intent varies. You don't really know that about a person when you're being labeled in the
Yeah, so it's interesting. On the one hand, you have like the liberal political style, which, I mean, yeah, there are people on the left that embrace kind of aspects of like liberal politics. It's not to say necessarily the worldview, but the tactics, which tends to be spectacularly undemocratic, like in certain ways, like, depending on the elected officials kind of like carry out certain policies without accountability. And then you have this, which is like the extremely centralized, like so centralized that you have to have the exact correct party line, or like you can't be an organization, which is why you have those like tiny, like little left groups, like
How
it's
are
like
you
10 people
supposed
to
to
split.
organize when you're all split into these like subcategories that have like half of an ideological difference? It doesn't really make sense, especially if you're trying to form mass movements that are all at least partially on the same page. So I agree with you.
I feel like that point kind of in that in some ways considering like the previous slide and the last point that you made, or 2 slides ago about reformism, I think that there's kind of a fine line to walk between being seen as not revolutionary enough or not critical enough of the state, not envisioning enough of a liberated future, but then being so kind of like ideologically strict that any variance from that ideology is not welcome here in the organizational structure. And so I think that just in terms of the broader topic of leftist unity, at least in my experience, that's kind of
it's a significant roadblock.
Yeah.
Sorry to minorly interrupt the presentation, but if the people behind the camera have a charger,
It's USB-C. I don't know how to. It's like
that should be fine. I think.
There you go. Yeah, while you're doing that, yeah, I guess I would say maybe this is just because I haven't like hung out in like leftist circles for long enough, but I don't really hear the term like revisionism or anti-revisionism very much. Like that's like, I mean, I hear it in the context of like revisionist history, like oh, like you're, you know, like that's that's bullshit. That's not actually what happened. That's revisionist history. But like, you know, but like I guess that's like a very different thing.
Yeah.
Like revising history is different from like revising what to do going. It seems like revisionism is like good. If we're like we should be constantly like revising like how we're like, you know, how we're gonna move forward or whatever. So like, you know, like revisionism seems I don't know, if that's like a slur, it doesn't seem like a very good one.
So this isn't in reference to historical revisionism,
Right.
which is a completely different subject.
I see.
The less interesting, more dangerous kind,
Okay.
as historical revisionism affects leftist organizations particularly hard.
Right.
As they tend to lack a more mainstream presence, so they aren't as publicly recorded as more mainstream liberal organizations might be, and are often doxxed or harassed into silence by far right-wing organizations. So there's a larger base against you, I feel as though, when you're a leftist organization. So combating both historical revisionism and drawing a fine line between actual revisionism in your organization, like what that actually would be for you as you've created it, are two completely different things. That's like they have different slides.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was the mouse kind.
I see.
This is the more mainstream kind. So like Disney would be a pretty good example of historical revisionism with like a
Right.
or
Oh, I see.
So that would be more on the cultural end. So how do we as organizations combat historical revisionism concerning our works locally? How might we better document our actions in a manner that allows less room for misinterpretation? How do we as organizations combat anti-Marxism/anti-leftism erasure overall? And how do we as organizations recognize the history of an ideology as it was while still not backing down on our positions? So the last point is particularly important because historical revisionism often brings in like literal fake facts concerning past movements. So how you address them on the daily and how you decide to interact with those who may bring revisionism to your feet is really important. So making sure that you address such issues with tact and not just like turning away from the person. Like they just have literally no facts. Like they're looking at the wrong data sheet. They're looking at a Nazi data sheet. So this is the type that you were.
Yeah. So the hole in the door, did it happen or not? I'm just kidding.
It's okay.
Scared me.
My presentation kind of glitched out a little bit, but I wanted to talk a little bit about organizational management, which is the bulk of my presentation in reality. I wanted to talk specifically about the case of Valve. Does anyone here play video games? Are you familiar with the organization?
They did that.
Steam.
Yeah,
Yes.
one of my favorite
Steam
things.
engine.
Yeah.
Does anyone use that? All right, we have a couple in the audience who are gamers. So Valve is a really popular organization that is actually flat. So they operate within groups that are formed by the individuals themselves, and at their peak they had 250 members in 2012 and generated, I believe, $3 billion in revenue. So this is a pretty good example of an existing horizontally managed organization that has been not only highly profitable, but still exists to this day. I wanted to find like a more contemporary, relevant example of that. As often, the examples pointed to are often like too far in the past, or they're not really operating fully within like a capitalist structure. But Valve is a company that to this day remains highly profitable and is managed flat. So there are some other organizations that operate within capitalist structures that have semi-attempted this managerial style. Some of those semi-attempts include like Whole Foods.
Sort of like Zappos also? Or?
Zappos. Yeah. Actually, Valve was the most profitable company for its size ever that year in 2012 when they generated $3 billion in revenue. So I'm not saying that wealth was distributed evenly among the employees, as that would be pretty insane. However, it does prove that this managerial style does function as it should. And while the artificial hierarchy of work is divided differently, there still may be ableist hierarchies or those based upon different personality types that may occur within this managerial style. So it's really important to maintain open communication. And especially in our current society, it's becoming increasingly easy to do so. You could just send a mass email blast, or if someone wants to be involved in something, they could just opt into it as opposed to having to go through layers of bureaucracy in order to do so. And particularly when it comes to leftist organizations, I feel as though it's a particularly viable option, as even those who are new recruits, particularly today in 2018, I feel as though have the resources to, before they enter the organization, do some legwork themselves, in addition to learning through an integration process, as I did with my respective organization. So that's my favorite example because I play a lot of video games. Go ahead.
I feel like Valve isn't the best example because everyone works on what they want to work on in that company, and no one wants to work on like the social management, like forum moderation, review modding. So there's like a ton of review modding games that have like women, people of color in the game just for being in the game, and that's like a huge problem that no one wants to touch because it's like such a hard thing to deal with.
And more to the point, I feel as though it's semi-inherent in gamer culture overall, those types of sexist, racist stereotypes being implemented in games and then unaddressed by the fan base or encouraged by the fan base. So as far as Valve or Steam in particular giving those people a platform, I don't feel as though that is reflective of their managerial style. I feel as though that is more reflective of the culture in which they operate. Another point that people often bring up when I mention Valve is their bonus system. So at the end of every year, everyone votes on who gets bonuses based on the most profitable project for that year overall. So the monetary incentive honestly would be more problematic than their managerial style, as they aren't being incentivized to moderate forums or have a stricter admittance process for the games that they allow onto their platform, but rather they are being provided monetary incentive just for generating the most revenue. So that would be like the problematic aspect about, again, they are operating within a capitalist system. I don't really expect a $3 billion corporation to be like on it. Sorry, go ahead.
You have to apologize. What is it? So like Steam, like I get, I accept all of your criticisms as valid. I just look at Steam as like you gotta take your victories where you can like get them or whatever. Like Steam though was like it like sprung up kind of like organically. It was like the people who developed the platform and the system like stayed with it, and they like wanted like
And that would employ
right, like
models.
built into the platform was the vision of like how this platform should be managed day to day. But like Zappos, like the shoe like delivery company, or like the Amazon for shoes or whatever, the CEO in like 2014, I think it was, just said like, yeah, we're just gonna like do straight up like no titles, no positions, everyone just come into work like and just put your best foot forward. And people were like, if I have a question, who do I ask? It's just like, I don't know, man. Like, you gotta just like figure it out. We're just gonna kick it and like make the delivery shoes. And like the turnover went from like 3% to like 30%. Like, is that people are showing up being like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do or who I'm supposed to talk to or what I'm supposed to be working on. Like, so it was like disheartening. But like Steve, like to watch something flourish and like watch like that system of management like built into the platform. I don't know, maybe I think it's just the organic development of the platform with like a vision for it.
Is is that a publicly traded company? Like I'm not really I'm not familiar with the case so much. Like is that like do they have like stockholders and that board directors
I'm
or
not on
something?
the now.
Because that's like that would be like another layer obviously because like unlike say a political organization, they have a customer base, they have a fan base. If they're publicly traded, they obviously have other kind of masters that they have to answer to. And so, it's admirable that they keep a certain horizontal structure, but yeah. So
this isn't about
more
like
specific.
the greater company. It's just that in terms of managerial styles, I've often found, particularly in leftist organizations, it's not presented as an option to have a flat organization. Like it's just taken off the table. You have a boss the minute you get into the NGO.
It's not
So-
publicly traded.
Okay, so it's not publicly traded. Honestly, it's just gamers. Like they suck. That would be a completely different presentation. But they do a good job at management. Like I'll give them that. Let's see. Satisfies the visual need for autonomy and self-realization. And then some BS psychology stuff. So I feel as though implementing basic psychology and marketing into your organization is really important. And another reason why I wanted to use Valve as an example of that is particularly in its prime, it was fairly well known for its marketing and for having few employees, but like S tier, very well known, top of the class type employees who would often be more productive in these settings than they would otherwise. So I feel as though that extends to leftist circles as well, as there should be an orientation process to make sure that everyone is on the same page. But beyond that, if you would like to work on a particular project and others are also interested in that project that you are working on, there shouldn't really be a bureaucratic system beyond that, particularly if you're working just as a local organization. So these are the unbearably corny stages of team development. It actually goes clockwise: forming, storming, norming, performing. There's a fifth one, but it's completely
Oh, sorry.
irrelevant.
Sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. I just wanted one that had 4 instead of the 5. But I wanted to kind of zone in on the storming stage of team development, because I feel as though, particularly with locals, this is where a lot of people get stuck. And I feel as though, particularly with more pyramid style, hierarchical, managed organizations, it can become even more of a problem, because the say is often isolated at those few people or at one particular person. So if they are particularly inflexible on a subject, then it just won't happen. The event won't happen, or whatever you're trying to collaborate with them on is dead on arrival because of this one person. So that's how it relates to the previous, but just on its own, crisis management and dealing with other individuals in a way that is productive and doesn't come off as particularly confrontational. As a friend of mine made a weird comment the other day as I was preparing this presentation on libertarian socialism as a whole and the movement, and how difficult it is to get different types of organizations in on the same event. And they're like, oh, it's because you guys are right. That's why it's so difficult. People get really caught up on minuscule details that are irrelevant to the project or ultimate goal that you were trying to achieve. And getting caught up in those details, you kind of distract yourself from what your goal as an organization is, and as your goal as someone who is trying to ultimately abolish the state is. So I feel as though in that stage comes a lot of distraction, and in that stage comes a lot of, I guess, unrest. People get really disheartened by other organizations when there's some conflict, but it's really just interacting with others organizationally when they have their own respective hierarchies and their own respective structures, and then trying to bring that into a setting where they do not, the people that you are interacting with don't do things exactly the same way that you do. So I did want to kind of zone in on that. Generally speaking though, I do consider these stages of team development to be particularly useful, not necessarily from a psychological tint, but just as a guide. I tend to use it whenever I'm working on something with others. I try and like phase in my mind where we are, what we're doing, if people start kind of like giving up last second, people aren't engaging as much as they used to, it's probably because you're in the storming phase, and it's probably because, well, A, you're either taking it personally and they're really busy, or B, they are getting caught up in something that is completely irrelevant to the topic at hand concerning this particular event or whatever you were trying to do with them. So, weathering the storm, really. The other stages of team development are actually a lot less interesting. However, I do consider them to be fairly accurate. I don't consider them to be a timeline, however, for like when exactly a team is going to go through a particular stage. They could skip one, they could not go through any of them. And I would also clarify that norming is one of those words that people will hear and then think that it's something other than what it is. In this context, I would consider it to be getting everyone on the same page and making sure that everything is organized enough so that you can properly execute whatever you are attempting to in that moment. So just to clarify on stage 3.